In the early hours of a tense American century, long before prophecy became entertainment and long before the word prediction was diluted by algorithms and headlines, there lived a woman whose name would quietly haunt the corridors of power. Jeane Dixon did not announce herself as a spectacle. She did not build a movement. She did not chase followers. Yet, again and again, history seemed to bend in the direction she had already described. And that is where this story must begin. Not with Donald Trump, not with politics, but with credibility earned the hard way, through events no one wanted to believe until it was far too late. Jeane Dixon was born in 1904, raised in a deeply Catholic household, and from a young age claimed to experience visions during moments of prayer. Unlike many who spoke vaguely about feelings or impressions, Dixon spoke in dates, roles, symbols, and outcomes. Her words were written down, published, archived. They could be checked, and that was precisely what made them dangerous. In 1956, at a time when John F. Kennedy was still a rising political figure with no guarantee of reaching the White House, Dixon stated publicly that a young Democrat would win the presidency and die in office by violence. At the time, the claim sounded absurd, even cruel. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, that old prediction resurfaced, printed again, reread in silence. Laughter turned into something colder. Skepticism gave way to unease. It did not stop there. Years earlier, Dixon had spoken of a beloved Hollywood icon whose life would end suddenly under mysterious circumstances. She described beauty wrapped in sorrow, fame paired with despair. When Marilyn Monroe was found dead in 1962, the parallels were impossible to ignore. And then came the warning about the Pope. In the mid-1960s, Dixon cautioned that a Catholic leader would face an attack. Not a metaphorical one, a physical threat. In 1965, during Pope Paul VI's visit to the Philippines, a man rushed toward him with a knife and was stopped at the last moment. Once again, her words aligned with reality just closely enough to disturb even those who wanted to dismiss them. These were not vague horoscopes. They were not predictions that could be bent after the fact. They were specific, uncomfortable, and documented. And because of that, Jeane Dixon began to occupy a strange place in American consciousness. She was not fully embraced, nor fully rejected. She was tolerated, watched, occasionally consulted. For believers, she was a messenger. For skeptics, a statistical anomaly. For those in power, she was something else entirely. A risk. Dixon herself never claimed ownership of her visions. She insisted they were not hers to control, only to receive. She described them as impressions delivered during prayer, images that arrived uninvited and refused to leave until spoken aloud or written down. This framing mattered. In a deeply religious America, prophecy tied to faith carried a different weight than fortune-telling tied to spectacle. Her Catholicism gave her legitimacy among Christians who believed history was not random, but guided, tested, by a higher hand. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Jeane Dixon's reputation had solidified. Not because every prediction came true, they did not, but because enough of them did, and with such precision that coincidence became an increasingly weak explanation. Politicians took notice, not publicly, quietly. There were no press conferences announcing meetings with Dixon, no official records, but stories began to circulate. Whispers of late-night visits, of cars parked discreetly outside her modest Washington home, of powerful men and women seeking answers they could not find in intelligence briefings or economic forecasts. This was the world Dixon inhabited, a narrow space between faith and fear, between reverence and suspicion. She became, in effect, a mirror. People did not come to her simply to hear the future. They came to hear their future, to know whether their rise would hold, whether their fall could be avoided. Some left reassured. Others left shaken. All left changed. And that is perhaps the most overlooked part of her legacy. Prophecy does not need to control events to influence them. It only needs to alter decisions. As Dixon aged, her public presence diminished, but her private influence did not. In fact, it deepened. Her later visions, according to those close to her, grew more symbolic, more layered. Less about names, more about forces. Less about single events, more about trajectories. She began speaking of America not as a nation of borders and institutions, but as a spiritual entity, capable of awakening, capable of deception, capable of collapse from within. These were not messages that translated well to newspaper columns. They were unsettling, ambiguous, easy to misunderstand. So many of them remained unpublished, scattered through journals, letters, and second-hand accounts. It is here, in this quieter phase of her life, that the most controversial threads emerge. Threads that do not point backward to events already validated by history, but forward into unresolved questions. Dixon spoke of leaders yet to rise, of figures wrapped in light and shadow, of a nation tested not by invasion, but by belief. She warned that America's greatest danger would not come from foreign enemies, but from confusion, when truth and illusion would blur, and people would follow what comforted them rather than what was real. At the time, these warnings felt abstract. America was changing, yes, but it always had. Every generation believed it stood at a crossroads. And yet, Dixon persisted in returning to the same symbols: gold, power, the eagle, the idea of sleep, of a nation unaware of its vulnerability. She wrote not with urgency, but with inevitability, as if describing a storm already forming beyond the horizon. What makes these late visions different is not their drama, but their restraint. Dixon did not name names. She did not declare villains or heroes. Instead, she described roles, archetypes, tests. She believed prophecy was not fate, but warning, that the future could bend if enough people recognized the signs in time. But she also believed that warnings ignored carried consequences. By the time Jeane Dixon died in 1997, much of what she had seen remained unresolved. Her earlier predictions had secured her place in history, but her later ones lingered like unfinished sentences. And for years, they stayed that way. Quiet, dormant, waiting. Until events began to unfold that made those old symbols feel less abstract and more uncomfortably familiar. Because prophecy does not announce its relevance, it waits to be recognized. And somewhere within Dixon's final writings lies the description of a figure who would rise when the eagle slept. A figure surrounded by gold. A figure adored by millions and questioned by few. A figure who would not simply lead a nation, but divide it, test it, and reflect it back to itself. But before that figure can be understood, before the symbols can be examined, one question must be faced honestly. If Jeane Dixon was right before, when no one wanted her to be, what happens if she was right again? By the time Jeane Dixon's name faded from newspaper headlines, her influence had already slipped into places where headlines never reach. Public curiosity had given way to private concern, and what remained was not a celebrity prophetess, but a quiet presence hovering at the edge of decision-making. History rarely records the moments when powerful people hesitate. It records outcomes, not the doubts that precede them. And yet, it is in those unseen moments that Dixon's second life unfolded. There were no official schedules announcing visits to her home, no photographs of handshakes. But stories persisted, repeated too often and with too much consistency to be dismissed entirely. Senators, business magnates, military advisors, even foreign envoys. They came not because they believed blindly, but because uncertainty has a way of humbling even the most confident minds. When the future feels unstable, people look for patterns. Dixon offered something few others could, a narrative that stretched beyond polling data and intelligence reports into the realm of meaning. Her Washington home became, in effect, a threshold space. Those who entered did so quietly, often under the cover of night. Not to be told what they wanted to hear, but to ask questions they could not ask anyone else. Would a war escalate or dissolve? Would a political gamble pay off or backfire? Was a rising figure destined for greatness or collapse? Dixon never framed her responses as commands. She spoke in images, in symbols that lingered long after the conversation ended. And perhaps that was the most powerful part. She did not remove responsibility, she amplified it. What made these encounters unsettling was not simply their secrecy, but their implications. If even a fraction of these stories are true, then prophecy was not merely observing history from the sidelines. It was brushing against it, whispering into the margins. Dixon herself was careful. She rarely discussed these meetings, and when she did, she minimized their importance. She insisted she was not there to guide policy, only to relay impressions. But impressions can shape choices just as effectively as instructions. Some accounts suggest Dixon warned of moments when restraint would be wiser than force, when pride would invite disaster. Others claim she spoke of leaders whose rise would feel miraculous, only to fracture the nation that lifted them. None of these accounts are signed. None are official. They exist in the gray space of oral history, where truth and myth intertwine. But that gray space is precisely where prophecy thrives. As the Cold War intensified, Dixon's warnings took on a broader tone. She spoke less about individual events and more about systems under strain. About a world dividing not just politically, but spiritually. She warned that when people lose a shared sense of truth, they become easy to lead, but impossible to unite. This idea, radical at the time, would later feel eerily prescient. She believed the future would not be decided by armies alone, but by narratives, by what people chose to believe. In this period, Dixon began referring to America as the eagle more frequently. The symbol was ancient, drawn from scripture and empire alike. To her, the eagle represented strength, vision, and divine responsibility. But she also warned that even eagles could sleep. That vigilance, once lost, invited manipulation. She spoke of a time when the eagle would be distracted, comforted by spectacle, divided by noise, while forces moved beneath the surface. Those closest to Dixon noticed a shift. Her visions grew heavier, not in tone, but in consequence. She no longer spoke of isolated tragedies or victories. She spoke of tests, of mirrors held up to nations. She believed leaders would emerge not merely to rule, but to reveal. That certain figures would act as catalysts, drawing hidden tensions into the open. These leaders would not create division, she said. They would expose it. It is important to understand what Dixon did not say. She did not predict the end of the world. She did not declare dates of destruction. Instead, she warned of moments of decision, forks in the road where societies choose comfort over truth, or truth over comfort. In her view, prophecy existed not to terrify, but to prepare. Yet preparation requires awareness, and awareness was precisely what she feared was fading. As decades passed, many of Dixon's private warnings were forgotten, filed away as relics of a more superstitious era. America entered new cycles of prosperity and crisis. Presidents came and went. The world changed. And for a time, It seemed as though Dixon's later visions would remain unresolved footnotes in history. But symbols have a way of resurfacing when conditions align. In the years after her death, fragments of Dixon's writings began circulating again, particularly among religious and prophecy-focused communities. Notes about a figure of gold, references to a leader who would rise amid disillusionment, promising restoration while awakening division. At first, these fragments felt like curiosities. Interpretations varied. Some saw hope, others saw warning. Most saw nothing at all. Then, slowly, the cultural landscape shifted. Wealth became spectacle. Politics became theater. Language hardened. Trust eroded. And as America entered an era defined by polarization, the idea of hidden influence no longer felt far-fetched. People began asking different questions, not just who holds power, but how power shapes belief. In this environment, Dixon's old warnings gained new resonance, not because they named specific outcomes, but because they described patterns unfolding in real time. The notion that a leader could command devotion without consensus, that faith could be weaponized, that truth could fracture into competing realities. These were no longer abstract concerns, they were lived experiences. And so, the whispers returned. Not of secret meetings, but of secret meanings, of symbols waiting to be interpreted, of prophecy not as prediction, but as diagnosis. Dixon had once said that the most dangerous prophecies were the ones people recognized too late, that by the time symbols became obvious, the test was already underway, which raises a question that cannot be answered with documents or recordings. If prophecy influences decisions, even subtly, then how many turning points were shaped by words spoken in private rooms? How many leaders hesitated, advanced, or retreated because a warning lingered in their mind? We may never know, but the possibility alone reshapes how history is viewed. Not as a straight line, but as a conversation between choice and consequence. As America moved deeper into the 21st century, one of Dixon's recurring symbols began to feel less symbolic and more literal. Gold. Not just as wealth, but as identity, as promise, as illusion, and with it, the image of a figure rising into prominence, surrounded by adoration and controversy in equal measure. The eagle, perhaps, was sleeping, and something was preparing to wake it. Long before names attached themselves to symbols, Jeane Dixon understood that prophecy rarely arrives as a photograph. It comes as a painting, layers of color, shadow, and suggestion that only sharpen with time. In her later writings, one image appeared again and again, sometimes directly, sometimes veiled within metaphor. She described a figure rising from the west, radiant and commanding, surrounded by a glow she called deceptive in its beauty. She did not call him a king. She did not call him a tyrant. She called him golden. Gold, in Dixon's symbolic language, was never neutral. It was not merely wealth or success. Gold represented temptation dressed as salvation, brilliance that distracts from substance. In Scripture, gold often accompanies idols, objects that shine brightly enough to draw devotion away from what truly matters. Dixon knew this. She chose her symbols carefully. When she spoke of a golden figure, she was not admiring him. She was warning of the power such a figure could wield over perception. She wrote of crowds drawn to this radiance, not because they had been persuaded through reason, but because they had been captured by promise. The figure, she said, would emerge at a moment of fatigue, when people were tired of complexity and hungry for certainty. He would speak simply, boldly, offering restoration rather than explanation. To many, he would feel like an answer to prayer. To others, a provocation. But to Dixon, he was something else entirely, a test. For years, these passages sat quietly in journals and letters, unremarkable to those who read them without context. But as the decades passed, the image of gold began to echo beyond metaphor. America entered an age where wealth was no longer private. It was displayed, celebrated, broadcast. Towers gleamed. Brands became identities. Success was measured not just by achievement, but by visibility. And slowly, the golden figure Dixon described no longer felt abstract. Donald Trump had long cultivated an image inseparable from gold. His name emblazoned on buildings that reflected sunlight like monuments, interiors adorned with gilded excess, language steeped in superlatives. For supporters, this aesthetic symbolized strength, victory, and unapologetic success. For critics, it represented vanity and excess. Dixon's symbol seemed to straddle both interpretations effortlessly, but the resemblance went deeper than appearance. Dixon described the golden figure as one who would command attention instinctively, bending media and crowds toward himself without understanding fully why it worked. She warned that his power would not come from wisdom, but from resonance, from his ability to reflect the frustrations and desires of the masses back at them. He would say what others avoided. He would simplify what others complicated. And in doing so, he would become larger than policy, larger than ideology. Importantly, Dixon never suggested this figure was consciously malicious. In fact, she implied the opposite. She believed he would not fully grasp the forces empowering him, that he would mistake adoration for mandate, applause for affirmation. In her view, this ignorance made him more dangerous, not less. Because a leader who believes he alone carries the solution becomes blind to the consequences of division. As Trump's rise accelerated, prophecy circles began revisiting Dixon's words with renewed intensity. Some saw confirmation. Others saw opportunistic reinterpretation. But even skeptics admitted the parallels were unsettling. A leader rising amid distrust of institutions. A figure adored and despised in equal measure. A presidency defined not by quiet governance, but by constant spectacle. Gold, everywhere. Yet Dixon's warning was not about wealth or style. It was about substitution. She feared that people would confuse confidence with truth, dominance with destiny. That in times of uncertainty, humanity gravitates toward those who appear unshakable, even if the foundation beneath them is fragile. The golden figure, she said, would feel like a savior to some and a serpent to others. The danger lay not in choosing a side, but in forgetting to question the symbol itself. She also warned that this figure would emerge when the eagle was vulnerable, when America's sense of shared reality had begun to fracture. In such moments, gold becomes more than decoration. It becomes reassurance, a promise that strength still exists, that greatness can be restored without sacrifice. Dixon believed this promise would be intoxicating, and like all intoxicants, it would dull discernment. What made her vision particularly unsettling was its neutrality. She did not label the golden figure as evil. She did not celebrate him as divine. She placed him in the role of mirror. Through him, she believed, America would see itself more clearly than ever before. Its hunger for authority, its fear of decline, its willingness to trade nuance for certainty. As Trump took office, that mirror effect intensified. Supporters projected hope, pride, and defiance onto him. Critics projected fear, anger, and disbelief. Both sides believed the stakes were existential. Dixon had warned of this polarization. She said the golden figure would not unite the nation. He would reveal its fractures, forcing hidden tensions into the open. In that sense, his rise was not the crisis. The response to his rise was. Still, Dixon's writings contained one more layer. She believed that gold, when struck by lightning, does not vanish. It cracks. She hinted that the golden figure would face moments of sudden exposure, when the illusion of invincibility would falter. Not necessarily through defeat, but through revelation, through events that force re-evaluation. At this stage of the story, Dixon's prophecy remains deliberately unresolved. She did not predict how the golden figure would fall or rise again. She did not specify dates or verdicts. Instead, she asked a question that echoes uncomfortably in the present. When confronted with brilliance, will people seek truth beneath it, or bow to the shine? Because prophecy, in Dixon's view, was never about foretelling a man's destiny. It was about testing a nation's discernment. And the test, she believed, was only beginning. Among the many fragments Jeane Dixon left behind, there is one entry that continues to unsettle researchers not because of its drama, but because of its timing. Written in 1979, long before Donald Trump became a political figure, and long before the slogan that would later define an era entered public consciousness, Dixon described a moment she called the sleep of the eagle. To understand why this matters, one must first understand what the eagle meant to her. In Dixon's symbolic language, the eagle was America itself, not merely a nation-state, but an idea, strength bound to responsibility, vision tied to moral clarity. The eagle was meant to see far, to soar above confusion. But in her writings, Dixon warned that even the strongest symbols could weaken, not through attack, but through complacency. An eagle does not fall when it is struck. It falls when it no longer watches the sky. In the 1979 entry, Dixon wrote of a leader who would rise when the eagle sleeps. The phrase was not poetic decoration. She used sleep deliberately to suggest distraction rather than defeat. She believed America would enter a period where it felt secure enough to stop questioning itself, where spectacle replaced vigilance, and where comfort dulled discernment. It was in this environment, she warned, that a particular kind of leader could emerge. She described him as persuasive rather than appointed, elevated by attention rather than lineage. His strength, she said, would come not from tradition, but from performance. He would speak directly to the people, bypassing institutions, and in doing so, weaken them further. At the time, these words seemed abstract. America in the late 1970s was navigating economic uncertainty and geopolitical tension, but the idea of a media-driven leader dominating the national psyche felt premature. Then came the second line, the one that continues to echo with uncomfortable familiarity. Dixon wrote that this leader would promise to make the Republic great again. Not improved, not reformed, restored. The phrasing mattered. Restoration implies loss. It assumes something precious has been taken and can be reclaimed. Dixon believed this promise would resonate deeply in a population convinced it had fallen from a former height. Decades later, when Donald Trump stepped onto the political stage wielding the slogan, "Make America Great Again," the similarity was impossible to ignore. Critics dismissed the connection as coincidence. Supporters saw destiny. Prophecy circles saw confirmation. But Dixon's warning was never about the slogan itself. It was about what the slogan awakened. She believed such language would stir memory rather than vision, that it would pull people backward emotionally, even as it pushed them forward politically. In her view, nostalgia was one of the most powerful tools of persuasion, because it bypasses logic and appeals directly to identity. When people are told they have been diminished, they look for someone who promises to restore their sense of worth. Dixon also warned that this leader's voice would shake the nations, not through policy alone, but through presence, through constant visibility, through the ability to dominate attention so completely that even opposition amplified him. This, too, would weaken the eagle's vigilance. When everything revolves around a single figure, nuance disappears. Complexity becomes exhaustion. As Trump's presidency unfolded, these dynamics became impossible to separate from daily life. Supporters saw strength where others saw recklessness. Critics saw danger where others saw liberation. Institutions strained under the weight of constant confrontation. Dixon had foreseen this strain. She wrote that the eagle's sleep would not be peaceful. It would be restless, filled with noise, argument, and distraction. Yet the most overlooked part of Dixon's 1979 entry is its conclusion. She did not say the leader would destroy the republic. She said he would awaken the serpent of division. The serpent, in her symbolism, represented latent conflict, resentments long ignored, truths long suppressed. The serpent did not create division. It revealed it. And once awakened, it could not simply be put back to sleep. This distinction is crucial. Dixon did not portray the leader as the source of America's fractures. She portrayed him as the trigger, the catalyst. Through him, what had been hidden would surface. Conversations once confined to private spaces would spill into public view. Beliefs once softened by civility would harden into identities. She also warned that during this period, people would mistake noise for clarity. That volume would replace substance, that loyalty would eclipse discernment. The eagle, distracted by constant motion, would struggle to see the horizon. And in that struggle, the nation would face a choice, not between leaders, but between ways of seeing. Dixon believed prophecy reached its most dangerous point when people used it to justify certainty. She cautioned against declaring any leader fully righteous or fully corrupt. Instead, she urged observers to watch patterns, to notice what was being revealed, not just who was being elevated. The true test, she believed, was not whether the leader succeeded or failed, but whether the people learned from what his rise exposed. As the years passed and Trump's influence extended beyond a single term, Dixon's words gained new relevance. The slogan endured. The divisions deepened. The eagle, it seemed, had not yet fully awakened. And that raised a troubling implication. If the sleep was not over, then the test was not complete. Which leads to the question Dixon left unanswered. What happens when the eagle begins to stir? Does it rise renewed, having seen its reflection clearly at last? Or does it awaken too late, weakened by the very illusions it embraced? In Dixon's view, the answer depended not on the golden figure, but on the people who followed him, or opposed him, without ever questioning the mirror he held up to them. And somewhere beyond that moment of awakening, she believed, lay a reckoning still to come. Jeane Dixon believed that history does not move in straight lines. It circles, tightens, pauses, and then demands a choice. In her final years, her writings grew quieter in tone, but heavier in implication. She no longer focused on individual leaders alone, but on moments, windows of time when accumulated tensions converge. One such window, she hinted, lay ahead when numbers aligned in symbolic ways, when what had been postponed could no longer be delayed. She described it cryptically as the moment when the twin twos meet the turning six. To many who later studied her work, this phrase pointed unmistakably toward the year 2026. For Dixon, numbers were never mere dates. They were markers of cycles, thresholds rather than deadlines. She believed 2026 would not announce itself with a single dramatic event, but with a convergence of pressures, political, spiritual, psychological, that would force America to confront what it had become. The eagle, she wrote, would face a decision it could not avoid, to renew its wings or lose them. Renewal, in her language, did not mean victory. It meant humility, awareness, a willingness to see clearly. In these final visions, Dixon returned to the image of gold one last time. She spoke of a golden structure trembling, not collapsing outright, but cracking under the strain of exposure. Many interpreted this as metaphor. Pride shaken, illusion challenged. The idea that what shines brightest is often the most fragile. When lightning strikes gold, it reveals flaws that were always there. Dixon believed such a strike would come, not necessarily as punishment, but as revelation. By this point, her warnings had little to do with Donald Trump as an individual. He remained present in the symbolism, but only as a vessel. A mirror. Dixon emphasized that focusing too narrowly on one man missed the deeper message. Leaders come and go, she said. Tests remain. The true danger was not a presidency, but a pattern. The willingness of people to surrender discernment in exchange for certainty. She foresaw a period when truth itself would feel unstable, when information would multiply faster than wisdom, when people would retreat into reflections that comforted them, rather than confront realities that challenged them. She described this as the breaking of a mirror, not glass, but perception, a nation unable to recognize its own face. In such a moment, Dixon warned, belief becomes both weapon and refuge. And yet, even in her most sobering passages, Dixon did not abandon hope. She wrote of a remnant, not a select group, but a mindset. People who resist the pull of spectacle, who question what glitters, who choose patience over outrage. She believed these individuals would not dominate headlines, but they would shape outcomes quietly. Through them, she said, renewal remained possible. As 2026 approaches, Dixon's prophecies invite an uncomfortable reflection. Not about whether she was right in every detail, but about whether the patterns she described are visible now. A nation divided not just by politics, but by reality itself. A hunger for strong figures paired with a fatigue for complexity. A culture that rewards volume over insight. These were the conditions she warned about decades ago, long before they became familiar. What makes Dixon's legacy endure is not her accuracy alone, but her restraint. She did not tell people what to think. She asked them to watch, to notice, to remember that prophecy, in its purest form, is not destiny written in stone, but a question posed to conscience. What will you do when confronted with the truth about yourself? As this story slows, it is worth returning to where Dixon herself always returned, to responsibility. She believed the future was shaped less by leaders than by the collective willingness to see beyond symbols. Gold loses its power when people stop worshiping its shine. Eagles awaken when they remember why they were meant to soar. In the end, Dixon left no final verdict, no date circled in red, no single outcome guaranteed. She left a choice suspended in time. Renewal or reckoning. Awakening or collapse. Not as a threat, but as an invitation. And perhaps that is why her words still echo. Because somewhere between fear and hope, between spectacle and silence, the future remains undecided. It is shaped not by prophecy alone, but by how those who hear it choose to respond. As the noise fades and the symbols settle, one question lingers gently, almost whispered. When the moment comes, will the eagle recognize itself?